They called Colonel Mara Voss a boring army paper pusher for 15 years. My name is Mara Voss. I'm 43, a colonel in the United States Army, and at my sister's wedding last spring, she stood 3 feet away from me in a red satin dress and told her new husband's entire family that I worked some quiet desk job, nothing exciting, really. Her husband, a man I'd met only twice before that day, leaned toward his groomsman moments later and whispered something that visibly changed the color in my sister's face. "Colonel Voss runs black sites," he said, just loud enough for the small cluster around us to hear. "I've read the briefings. Don't let the quiet fool you." Before I explain how my brother-in-law knew details about my career that even my own sister had spent 15 years dismissing, let me take you back to where this particular family pattern actually started, because a single wedding reception doesn't create 15 years of casual condescension, it simply reveals it, all at once, in front of people who'd never questioned the story my sister had been telling. If you're the kind of person who watches a story through to the end, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. Drop your city and local time in the comments, I read every one. I grew up in Frederick, Maryland, the younger of 2 daughters. My father, Walter, worked as a high school history teacher. My mother, Judith, taught elementary music. My older sister, Cecily, 4 years my senior, had always been the more outwardly ambitious one within our family's specific value system, pursuing a marketing degree, then a series of increasingly visible roles at prominent firms in D.C., building a social circle and a lifestyle that photographed well and generated easy conversation at family gatherings. I joined the Army at 18, immediately after high school, a decision that had genuinely confused my parents at the time, coming from a family with no prior military tradition. What started as a practical decision, funding for college, a structured path toward independence, gradually became a genuine career, one I pursued with an intensity that surprised even me in those early years. By my late 20s, I'd been selected for increasingly specialized assignments within military intelligence, work that came with security clearances requiring me to discuss almost nothing specific about my actual daily responsibilities with anyone outside a very narrow professional circle. At family gatherings, when relatives asked what exactly I did, I developed a practiced, deliberately vague response: logistics and coordination work, mostly administrative, a description technically true in the broadest possible sense, while omitting almost everything that actually mattered about my actual responsibilities. Cecily, over those same years, developed her own narrative about my career, one built entirely from that vague description I'd offered, without ever asking meaningful follow-up questions. "Mara does some kind of paperwork thing for the Army," she'd tell her friends, her tone carrying the specific, dismissive lightness of someone discussing a sibling's unremarkable job. "Very quiet, very boring, honestly. I have no idea how she stands it." I didn't correct that characterization for years, partly because my actual work genuinely couldn't be discussed in detail, and partly because I'd grown accustomed to a specific dynamic within our family where Cecily's visible achievements consistently received more attention and celebration than whatever quiet, classified work I was doing thousands of miles away, in locations I couldn't specify, on projects I couldn't describe. By my mid-30s, I'd risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel, working on assignments connected to detention operations oversight and intelligence coordination that placed me, at various points, in direct operational authority over facilities and programs of considerable strategic significance, work that remained, by necessity, almost entirely invisible to my own family, who continued to understand my career through the same vague, outdated lens I'd established years earlier. Cecily married her first husband at 29, a marriage that ended in divorce 4 years later, and throughout that period and the years following, she continued building the specific family narrative that positioned her own visible, easily discussed corporate career as inherently more impressive than my boring paperwork job, a characterization I'd stopped actively fighting, exhausted by the impossibility of correcting a story I couldn't actually replace with accurate details. Cecily's second engagement, to a man named Julian Ashworth, came together relatively quickly, about 18 months before the wedding where everything finally shifted. Julian worked, according to Cecily's descriptions during family calls, in government consulting, a description as deliberately vague as my own had always been, though for entirely different reasons I wouldn't fully understand until the wedding itself. I'd met Julian only twice before the wedding, once at their engagement dinner, briefly, and once at a smaller family gathering the following month. Both encounters had been pleasant but unremarkable, Julian polite and reserved in a way that read, at the time, as simple social caution around a new extended family rather than anything more deliberate. The wedding itself took place at a vineyard outside Charlottesville, Virginia, a beautiful late spring afternoon that Cecily had been planning meticulously for over a year. I'd attended in a formal dress rather than my uniform, a choice I'd made deliberately, wanting the day to remain focused entirely on my sister rather than introducing any complication about my own career into an event that was, appropriately, about her. I stood near the edge of the reception during the cocktail hour, making polite conversation with several of Julian's groomsmen, when Cecily approached with her characteristic ease, introducing me to a small cluster of Julian's extended family with the exact phrasing I'd heard variations of for 15 years. "This is my sister, Mara," she said, her voice carrying the same casual dismissiveness she'd perfected over the years. "She works some quiet desk job, nothing exciting, really. I've genuinely never fully understood what she actually does all day." I smiled, the same practiced, patient smile I'd offered dozens of times before at similar moments, prepared to let the characterization stand without correction, the way I always had. What I didn't expect was for Julian, standing just close enough to overhear that exact introduction, to turn toward his own groomsmen with an expression I couldn't immediately read, and say something that would unravel 15 years of careful, deliberate vagueness in the space of a single sentence. I drove home that night in a silence that felt considerably heavier than the 90-minute journey usually warranted, replaying my mother's casual suggestion that I could, always just rent somewhere larger, while Preston sat 3 feet away holding an envelope containing more money than I'd saved across 9 years of disciplined, independent financial planning. I didn't confront my parents that evening. I've never been someone who processes anger quickly, and I understood, even in the moment, that whatever I said in the immediate aftermath of watching that envelope change hands would come out distorted by an emotional intensity I hadn't yet fully examined. Instead, I spent the following several weeks doing something I'd never previously allowed myself to do directly. I began cataloging, deliberately and honestly, the full financial history of how my parents had supported each of their children throughout our adult lives. I called my Aunt Priscilla, my father's sister, who'd always maintained a slightly more objective vantage point on our family's internal dynamics, given her own complicated relationship with my father over decades of sibling history. "Jordan, I've watched this pattern for years," she told me, once I'd laid out the specific details of that dinner. "Your father has always found it easier to rescue Preston from consequences than to simply let him build resilience the way you were forced to build yours. I think, somewhere along the way, your independence became something your parents took for granted, rather than something they recognized as requiring its own kind of ongoing investment and acknowledgement." Over the following month, I compiled, as precisely as I could reconstruct from memory and occasional documentation, a rough accounting of the disparity. Preston's private university tuition, largely covered directly by my parents, compared to my own loans for a considerably less expensive program. Preston's rent assistance during 2 separate unemployment stretches in his mid-20s. The co-signed car loan. Now, the $60,000 house down payment, delivered with ceremony and tears, compared to my mother's breezy suggestion that I simply continue renting if my current space ever felt insufficient. The total, once I'd added everything together as honestly as I could, exceeded $140,000 in direct financial support extended to Preston over the preceding decade, against essentially nothing extended to me beyond the polite, verbal acknowledgement of my own independent achievements. I met with a financial advisor, a careful, deliberate woman named Odessa Kilbride, specifically to understand my own actual financial position with complete clarity, wanting to make any subsequent decisions from a place of genuine strategic understanding rather than simply raw emotional reaction to what I'd witnessed at that dinner. "Jordan," she said, once we'd reviewed my full financial picture, "you're actually in a considerably stronger position than I think you've been giving yourself credit for. Your condo has appreciated significantly since your purchase, your retirement savings are well ahead of typical benchmarks for your age and income level, and you're consistent, Disciplined saving habits over the preceding 9 years have put you within genuine reach of purchasing a larger home on your own, without requiring any family assistance whatsoever. That consultation crystallized something for me that I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider directly before, that I didn't actually need my parents' financial support to achieve the same milestone they'd just handed Preston with ceremony and tears. What I needed, I realized, was to actually pursue that milestone deliberately, on my own terms, in a way that would make unmistakably clear exactly how capable I'd been all along, without requiring anyone's rescue. I found a property 3 weeks after that consultation, a modest but genuinely lovely 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood about 15 minutes from my current condo, priced within a range my own savings and a standard mortgage could comfortably absorb. I moved through the entire purchase process deliberately, quietly, informing my parents only once the closing had already occurred, the same pattern of independent decision-making I'd maintained throughout most of my adult financial life. I called my mother the evening after closing, keeping my tone deliberately neutral, informational rather than confrontational. "Mom, I wanted to let you know, I closed on a house today. 3 bedrooms, really lovely neighborhood, about 15 minutes from my old place." There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. "Jordan, that's wonderful. I had no idea you were even looking. How did you manage the down payment?" "Through my own savings, Mom. The same way I've managed everything else over the past 9 years." Another pause, this one carrying a different quality, something closer to discomfort. "I wish you'd told us you were considering this. Your father and I might have wanted to help, the same way we helped Preston." I felt something steady settle in my chest, hearing that specific offer, arriving only now that I'd already demonstrated I didn't actually need it. "Mom, I think if I'm honest, I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure the offer would have actually materialized the same way it did for Preston. I watched you and Dad hand him $60,000 with tears and ceremony, 3 weeks after telling me I could just rent somewhere if my condo ever felt too small. I didn't want to find out, by asking directly, whether that same generosity would have actually extended to me." The silence that followed that comment stretched considerably longer than any previous pause in our conversation, and I understood, wading through it, that I'd finally said something my mother couldn't easily deflect or reframe into a more comfortable narrative. 8 months after the wedding, I received notification of a promotion board recommendation for Brigadier General, a milestone that would place me among a small number of women to reach that rank within military intelligence oversight roles. I told my family the news during a routine Sunday call, expecting the same measured, slightly confused reaction that had characterized most previous career updates over the years. Instead, Cecily's response carried a different quality entirely. "Mara, I want to actually understand what this means. Not just congratulations, though obviously, congratulations. I want to understand what Brigadier General actually represents at your specific level of responsibility, so I can talk about this accurately with people, rather than falling back into the vague, dismissive descriptions I've used for years." I found myself, for the first time in our adult relationship, actually explaining the general shape of what such a promotion represented, the scope of responsibility, the years of specialized assignments that led toward this specific milestone, the significance within a career path that remained, by necessity, largely invisible to people outside a narrow professional circle. Cecily listened with genuine attention throughout that explanation, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real engagement rather than polite patience waiting for the conversation to shift back toward more comfortable, familiar territory. "I think," she said, once I'd finished, "I owe you a proper acknowledgement, not just at family gatherings but more broadly. Would you be comfortable if I mentioned your actual career, in general terms, to people who ask about you? Not specifics, obviously, just an accurate representation instead of the dismissive one I've maintained for 15 years. I'd appreciate that," I told her, meaning it genuinely. The promotion ceremony took place the following spring, a formal military event that Cecily and Julian both attended, along with my parents, marking the first time my entire family had witnessed, directly, the formal recognition of a career they'd spent over a decade quietly minimizing. Julian, during the reception following the ceremony, found himself in conversation with several senior officers whose work intersected with programs he had some professional familiarity with, conversations that reinforced, for Cecily, the genuine scope of the professional world I'd operated within, largely unacknowledged by our own family. "I keep thinking about that wedding," Cecily told me, during a quiet moment at the reception, watching Julian in animated conversation with a two-star general nearby. "How close I came to simply continuing that pattern indefinitely, if Julian hadn't happened to overhear my introduction and said something. I wonder, sometimes, whether I would have ever corrected the story on my own, without that specific, uncomfortable moment forcing it into the open." "I've wondered the same thing," I admitted. "I think I might have continued accepting the vague dismissal indefinitely too, if that moment hadn't happened. I'd grown accustomed to it, in a way that felt easier than confronting the pattern directly." "I'm genuinely grateful it happened the way it did," Cecily said. Uncomfortable as that afternoon was, watching my own husband correct 15 years of my careless assumptions in front of his family, in front of yours. I think I needed exactly that level of public discomfort to finally take the pattern seriously enough to actually change it. My promotion ceremony that day marked, in a way that felt appropriately symbolic, the formal culmination of a reckoning that had started, unexpectedly, at my sister's own wedding reception the previous spring, a moment where a stranger's whispered comment had exposed, in the space of a single sentence, a family dynamic that had taken 15 years to build and, remarkably, less than a year to genuinely begin repairing. 2 years have passed since that wedding reception where Julian's quiet comment first cracked open a pattern our family had maintained for 15 years. I now hold the rank of Brigadier General, overseeing intelligence coordination responsibilities that remain, by necessity, largely classified, though my family's understanding of the general shape of my career has grown considerably more accurate since that specific afternoon at the vineyard. Cecily and Julian's marriage has settled into its own rhythm, and their household has become, unexpectedly, one of the places where I feel most genuinely understood within an otherwise complicated professional life defined largely by discretion and invisible responsibility. Julian, in particular, developed a genuine, professional respect for my work that transcended simple family obligation, rooted in his own understanding of exactly what disciplined discretion within sensitive fields actually requires. My parents, in the years since, have made a consistent, deliberate effort to ask more accurate, more curious questions about my career during our regular calls, no longer settling for the vague, easily dismissed descriptions that had characterized our relationship for most of my adult life. "I think about that wedding often," my mother told me, during a recent visit home. "Not with embarrassment exactly, though there's some of that too. Mostly, I think about how easily we all fell into a comfortable story about you, simply because the alternative required more effort to understand. I'm grateful, genuinely, that something forced us to correct that before it became permanent." Cecily and I speak considerably more often now than we did during those earlier years of quiet dismissal, our conversations carrying a depth that simply hadn't existed when her understanding of my career remained frozen at some quiet desk job, nothing exciting. She's become, in her own words, aggressively accurate when describing my career to others, occasionally correcting people herself when they make the same casual assumptions she once made for 15 years. At a family gathering last winter, a distant cousin asked, in passing, what exactly I did for the army, using almost the exact dismissive phrasing Cecily herself had used for over a decade. Before I could offer my own carefully vague response, Cecily interjected directly. "She's a brigadier general overseeing intelligence coordination," she said, with a directness that would have been unthinkable from her just 2 years earlier. "It's considerably more significant than most people assume when they hear military job. I spent 15 years underselling my own sister's career because I never bothered asking real questions. I'm not making that mistake anymore." The cousin, visibly surprised by both the information and Cecily's uncharacteristic directness, spent the following several minutes asking genuinely curious questions, a small moment that felt, watching it unfold, like tangible evidence of exactly how much had shifted within our family's understanding since that afternoon at the vineyard. I think, often, about how differently things might have continued if Julian hadn't happened to overhear Cecily's introduction that day, if he'd simply let the moment pass without comment, allowing the same 15-year pattern to continue indefinitely into whatever future our family might have built without ever confronting it directly. What actually happened instead, an uncomfortable, public exposure of a dynamic none of us had been willing to name honestly, followed by genuine, sustained effort to rebuild a more accurate understanding between us, produced something considerably more valuable than the comfortable, dismissive story we'd maintained for over a decade. I still can't discuss the specifics of my work with my family, the fundamental nature of my career ensuring that certain boundaries will always remain in place, regardless of how much genuine curiosity my family now brings to understanding the general shape of what I do. But I no longer feel the particular loneliness of being quietly dismissed within my own family, replaced instead by a version of understanding that, while still necessarily incomplete, is finally built on genuine respect rather than convenient, careless assumption. Cecily's red satin dress from that wedding still hangs, I've noticed, in a garment bag in her closet, kept, she told me once, as a specific reminder of the exact moment she finally understood how much she'd been avoiding actually knowing her own sister. I keep it, she said, because I never want to forget how close I came to spending my entire life not really knowing you, simply because not knowing was easier than the effort required to actually understand. The end. I transitioned out of the Army 8 months later, an honorable discharge I'd requested rather than one that was pushed on me, and I want to be clear about why, because it wasn't the money that made the decision for me. It was Junie starting to pull herself up on the coffee table, wobbling on legs that hadn't existed the last time I'd deployed for a 2-week field exercise, and realizing I'd missed the first attempt entirely because I'd been in a motor pool 3 states away. 5 years of service had given me something I needed, a spine, a set of skills, the specific confidence that comes from proving to yourself you can survive on nothing but discipline and a paycheck too small for the work it covered. I didn't need the Army to keep proving that to me anymore. I needed to be present for the parts of my daughter's life that don't repeat themselves. Constance didn't try to talk me into staying in uniform, and she didn't try to talk me into anything else either. Not business school, not a board seat, not the life she'd once imagined for me before I'd chosen a different one at 22. What she offered instead, quietly, over a dinner at her house 6 weeks after my discharge came through, was something I hadn't expected from her at all. I want to fund something, she said. Not for you. For families like the one you were, standing in that commissary line 3 weeks before I found out what my son had done. She slid a folder across the table, not a legal document this time, just a plain manila folder with a handwritten title on the tab. Junie's Fund. Emergency grants, she said. Formula, diapers, rent bridges, whatever a young military family needs in the specific month things fall apart. No means testing bureaucracy, no 6-week wait for approval. If a caseworker on a base says a family needs $400 this week to keep the lights on, they get it by Friday. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Part of me, the part that still, honestly, carried some suspicion toward anything with the Reyes name attached to it, wondered whether this was penance dressed up as generosity, a way for Constance to feel better about 6 weeks of failing to notice her own son's theft. But watching her face while she said it, I didn't think that was quite right. I think she genuinely couldn't undo what had happened to me. And this was the closest thing she had to a way of making sure it happened to fewer people going forward. I want to run it, I told her. Not just fund it. Run it. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her since the diner. I was hoping you'd say that. We built it together over the following year, a small foundation, deliberately unglamorous, staffed mostly by military spouses who understood exactly what a Tuesday looks like when the formula budget and the electric bill are competing for the same $30. We kept the application to 1 page. We processed emergency requests within 72 hours. In the first year alone, we got formula, rent assistance, our utility bridges to over 1,100 families across 6 installations, and every single number in that count represented somebody standing in a checkout line doing the same grinding math I used to do, at 2 in the morning, with a baby finally asleep against my chest. My relationship with my parents settled into something smaller than what I'd had before I enlisted, but also, strangely, more honest than anything we'd managed in the 22 years before that. My father calls on Junie's birthday and doesn't push for more than that. My mother sends cards, still, occasionally, with handwriting that's steadier than it was in that conference room but never quite as confident as it used to be. I don't know if either of them has fully reckoned with what they did, or whether $5 million in restitution and a quiet family disgrace was ever going to be enough to make them. That's not really my work to finish. I did my part. I told the truth in a room full of lawyers, and I let the consequences land where they landed. Constance became something in my life I genuinely hadn't expected to get back. She comes to Junie's daycare graduation. She sends absurdly impractical gifts, the kind meant for a much older child, because she says she's making up for lost holidays and doesn't particularly care if the logic holds up. She still runs board meetings like a general and still terrifies half the attorneys who work for her, but she calls me every Sunday now, just to talk, and some Sundays we don't talk about the foundation or the trust or anything that happened in that conference room at all. Some Sundays we just talk about Junie learning to say new words, or a recipe she's trying, or nothing in particular, the way families are supposed to be able to do. 2 years out from that afternoon in the commissary, I stood in the small office we'd converted from an old guest cottage on Constance's property, the headquarters, such as it is, of Junie's fund, reading through an emergency request that had come in that morning from a base 3 states away. A specialist, 24 years old, single mother, formula and rent both due the same week, husband deployed and unreachable for another 6 weeks. The details were different. The shape of it was exactly the same as mine had been, down to the specific brand of formula she couldn't afford, the one that had briefly gone up nearly 40% in price the same month my own numbers had stopped working. We approved it in under an hour. I signed off on it myself, the way I try to sign off on every case personally, because I think there's something that matters about a real person reading a real name instead of a number moving through a system. I still think about the version of me who filled out that WIC application with shaking hands, convinced it was the loneliest thing I'd ever done. I wanted, from the very start, for this fund to be the thing that made sure fewer people had to feel that particular kind of alone. Junie turned 2 that spring. She has her father's laugh, the same one that used to fill up whatever room he walked into, and some mornings that's a hard thing to watch happen across a 2-year-old's face, and other mornings it's the best possible thing in the world. Constance comes to nearly everything now, the small birthday party with a cake from the commissary bakery, the pediatrician appointments she insists on driving me to even though I have a perfectly functional car, the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when she shows up unannounced with a bag of groceries neither of us particularly needs, because showing up seems to be the language she's chosen to speak fluently now, after 27 years of speaking mostly in board meetings and inherited expectations. My parents are, I think, exactly what they've decided to become in the aftermath, smaller, quieter, chastened in a way that isn't quite remorse but isn't quite indifference either. My father sold what remained of his stake in the family holding company last year, not because anyone forced him to, but because, he told me on the phone, he wasn't sure he trusted himself with that kind of responsibility anymore. It was the closest thing to genuine self-awareness I'd ever heard from him, and I let it sit there without either accepting or rejecting it, because some things don't need a verdict from me. They just need to be true or not true on their own. I don't know if I've forgiven them. I've stopped trying to figure out whether that's even the right word for whatever it is I actually feel. What I know is that I stopped needing anything from them the day Constance turned that phone screen around in a diner booth and showed me $210,000 a month disappearing into an account with somebody else's future stitched into it. Whatever they owe me now, they've already paid in the currency that mattered most, the truth, laid out in black and white, in a room with 3 attorneys and a monitor on the wall, where nobody could pretend anymore that the story they'd built was the real one. People ask me sometimes, usually other military spouses who've heard some version of the story secondhand, what it felt like standing in that checkout line, watching my grandmother's face go from fury to horror in under 10 seconds. I tell them the truth, which is that it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the floor of my whole life quietly giving way and then, just as quietly, being rebuilt underneath me by someone I hadn't expected to still be standing there. I kept my dress. Uniform. I don't wear it anymore, but it hangs in the closet of the house Constance helped me buy. Modest, by her standards, more than modest by the standards of the base housing I used to live in, and some nights I take it out just to remember the woman who stood in that line with $43 in her account and a baby asleep against her chest, entirely certain she was completely alone in the world. I want to tell her, if I could reach back across those 2 years, that she wasn't. That the family she thought had erased her had actually just been lied to as thoroughly as she had. That the people who are supposed to love you don't always show up on time, and sometimes they show up in a diner booth off base with a phone screen and a voice shaking with a fury they'd been saving, without knowing it, for exactly the right moment. If you've ever stood in a line like that one, asking for help you never thought you'd need, certain the people who were supposed to catch you had already let you fall, I want you to know something. The story other people tell about your struggle is not always the true one. Sometimes the truth is worse than you imagined. And sometimes, if you're fortunate the way I was fortunate, the truth is also the thing that finally sets you free.